Welcome to the off-season of the 32-team franchise. This is Doomhammer. We'll be going over in this video the GM and coach changes along with the retirements. Next video will be about free agency, then maybe 2 videos about the draft. One about the actual draft order itself, and then maybe a recap from each team how their draft turned out. But to get started on GMs, we see that Mark Hatley is out as the general manager of the Green Bay Packers. And John Dorsey, the former scout for them, or the current scout for them, moves up. I think he's like a director of personnel operations, whatever. But John Dorsey moves into the new role as a GM for Green Bay. They had a miserable season this year. They went 3-14, excuse me. Even worse. And so, of course, Mike Sherman got the boot, and so did Mark Hatley. They were the 32nd ranked team. They were in the 20s for their pass yards and rush yards in their defense. Offense, they were 19th in pass yards, 24th in rush yards. Did not do very well. Have not been able to cope since Brett Favre left, so Hatley's out. Then Rod Graves arguably has done a really good job of building talent in the Arizona team. They had so many talented players, but they just weren't able to gel on the field. You could say that was a coaching problem. They did hire Ken Wisenhunt last year, but he did not make any difference. Regardless of that, Rod Graves is fired, and we have Tom Heckert taking the job. Tom Heckert used to be with the Philadelphia Eagles. Saints get rid of Mickey Loomis. Again, the Saints were having a difficult time this year. They went with Drew Stanton as their starting quarterback over Mark Bulger, and of course, did not go too well. They were 5-12, 13th seed in the NFC. They were 5th in rush yards. So they had a good running game, but they just could not get anything to work. Ron Meeks, who was their head coach, is fired as well. Meeks was the defensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts, and he had 3 seasons, and none of them were impressive. We look at Dick Vermeil taking on the new role as general manager for the Saints. We'll see how he does as a general manager. Then the Chicago Bears, Ted Phillips is fired, and then he's replaced by Ray Farmer. Farmer is unwell for the Falcons, and he was helping find talent for Brad Childress, who was the head coach in Atlanta, build a playoff contender. So Ray Farmer gets the job as the general manager in Chicago. Then the Rams fire Charlie Armé. I don't know if that's French or not. We're going to say Armé. And they hire Ryan Grigson. So Ryan Grigson was a scout with the St. Louis Rams. He, in real life, was the Colts GM at one point. But in this case, he is now getting his GM opportunity with the St. Louis Rams. Now we're going to move to some of the coaches and some of the coach changes. So first one here is we have Tony Dungy retiring, and replacing him is Bill Cowher. Now, Bill Cowher was not as successful as he was in real life. So Cowher lost the 1997 Super Bowl against the Dallas Cowboys, but in my reality, he never won a Super Bowl with Pittsburgh. He had some bad seasons with Pittsburgh, led to his removal. Then he went to Cleveland, where he didn't have any success there. And so he kind of had a couple years off as a head coach. But since he did not win a Super Bowl, I do not think Bill Cowher would have just left and never come back. He never came back because he enjoyed his ESPN analyst job, but he was a Super Bowl champion. So in this case, we look at him coming back for the Indianapolis Colts, as he is very much a respected coach in the league. Now he's keeping Tom Moore. So Tom Moore was the offensive coordinator for Tony Dungy. That's staying the same. Now, Greg Williams gets a promotion. So he was a winning coach for the Buffalo Bills, a Super Bowl champion. He was a DC this past year when I believe it was Ron Meeks. Let me double check real quick here so I get you the right information for my Colts. Okay, so Bo Pelini was the defensive coordinator for 2 years after Ron Meeks left. Pelini ended up getting fired because the Colts kept ranking at the very bottom of the league in defense. So they ended up bringing in Greg Williams. But since Greg Williams is getting the promotion, we have Ron Meeks, who got fired as the Saints head coach, and he is now returning to the Indianapolis Colts to be the defensive coordinator for the Colts. Mike Holmgren also retires as the Seattle Seahawks head coach. And so with that role, of course, he was not able to get to the Super Bowl, unlike he did in real life. He won with the Green Bay Packers, but now they're going with Greg Schiano. Greg Schiano is the Carolina Panthers defensive coordinator, and they had the best defense in the entire league. They were first in almost every category. A lot to brag about. Eric Mangini was the former DC for the Panthers, and he went to Cleveland. I think they might have had another coordinator land somewhere. Let me double check here. Yep, Jack Del Rio was their first DC for 2 years. He went to Washington. Eric Mangini got a head coaching job in Cleveland, and now Greg Schiano is getting a job with the Seattle Seahawks. Now, of course, Carolina had some of the most talent on their defense, but we'll see if Greg Schiano is able to turn it around. Then we look at, they were first in points allowed, pass yards, rush yards, and takeaways. Number 1 for defense, all of them. Now, Jim Zorn is out as the offensive coordinator. Schiano's bringing in his own people. So Mike McCoy, the quarterback's coach for Carolina, comes with Greg Schiano to be his offensive coordinator. I felt that continuity was good. A similar face, someone he'd worked with. And then Rod Marinelli, I didn't know if I would fire him or necessarily. Seattle's defense wasn't terrible last year, but I decided that Rod Marinelli is going to get an NCAA coaching job, so good for him. And now Johnny Holland, the defensive line coach, is getting promoted from Seattle to being the new defensive coordinator. Their defense last year, they were 8th in points, 22nd in pass yards, but 2nd against the run. So I'm looking at the D-line being a major factor for Seattle with Mario Williams up front, leading to Johnny Holland getting that coaching job. Continuing on with more coaches, we have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Ron Meeks joining the Colts coaching staff because he is fired, going 21-30 in 3 years for the Saints. He had a debacle at QB because it was a failure to win games, a decline in the team's optimism. Basically, Ron Meeks is out. And so replacing him is the young up-and-comer Josh McDaniels. McDaniels was the offensive coordinator for New England for a couple years, their quarterback's assistant head coach kind of thing. Around this time, he got his Broncos job in real life. This time, he's going to New Orleans. Going with him, we see Brian Dable leaving the Saints, and Gil Haskell, who used to be the Seattle Seahawks offensive coordinator and was Cleveland's running back coach, ends up getting the nod to be the offensive coordinator in New Orleans. And then Vic Fangio is out as DC, replaced by Chuck Pagano, who got knocked out in Chicago when Johnny Lynn was fired. Speaking of which, Johnny Lynn is also fired. The head coach of the Chicago Bears, he had a 19-32 record in 3 years. He succeeded Dick Duron, who got fired after an 11-6 season where they failed to win the first round of the playoffs with Rich Gannon after several years of trying. So we thought that, okay, maybe the coach was the problem. Let's change it up. And instead, they missed the playoffs with Gannon. I kind of saw maybe a controversy there between the new coach and an experienced veteran quarterback. So Gannon left to Carolina, and then Johnny Lynn was left with Kerry Collins and drafting Brady Quinn, and none of them turned out. They had a hard time winning, so he's out. But now the recent Super Bowl champion offensive coordinator, Bruce Arians, who actually was the offensive coordinator both times they won the Super Bowl. And so Pittsburgh just recently won it, and so they won it back in 2005. They won it again here in 2009. So Bruce Arians is the man, the guy that is going to be taking on the Chicago Bears. A lot to rebuild there for Bruce Arians. The offensive coordinator replaced Bill Callahan is out, and Mike Hermodinger, I don't know if I say that right, Hermodinger is coming in as OC. He used to be a Titans offensive coordinator, bounced around as a position coach. And then you have Chuck Pagano leaving, and Jeff Fisher is now there. He was formerly with the St. Louis Rams as their defensive coordinator. Now he is the defensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears. Some other coaches fired, 2 very similar lookalikes. We have Mike Sherman from Green Bay and Mike Martz from St. Louis, both gone. Mike Sherman in Green Bay is replaced by DC Mike Tomlin from the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens have always boasted a very solid defense. They haven't necessarily ranked as well on their defense as I would have liked them to, But when you look at their offense versus their defense, they're definitely carried by their defense. And Tomlin was always seen as an up-and-comer, kind of a rising star coach, so that makes sense. And actually they were. They were the 5th ranked in points allowed, 6th ranked in pass yards, 5th ranked in rush, and 2nd in takeaways. So yes, Tomlin did earn this job. And then, of course, in doing so, he got rid of Tom Rossley, the OC, replaced him with Mark Trestman, quarterbacks coach for the New York Giants. And then Todd Bowles, the defensive backs coach for the Patriots, gets his opportunity as the Packers DC after Ed Donatel is out. For the Rams, Mike Martz is out. He had one of the worst seasons yet. He's almost had winning records every single year. Mike Martz happens to be the franchise leader in coaching wins. I think he's at 81, I believe, for Mike Martz. A very resounding. He used to only have like 40 some wins, but after me, he ended up having around 80, 81-ish, leading the franchise for St. Louis. And he's replaced by Greg Williams, who in my reality is actually a good coach. He won the Super Bowl back in 2003, the 2002-2003 season. He's a 55-60 record as a head coach. His last 2 years in Buffalo were rough, which is why he lost the job in Buffalo to Mike Munchak, and now he was the defensive coordinator for the Colts. Now he's the head coach for St. Louis. In doing so, he's removed Rob Chudzinski as OC, replaced him with Cam Cameron from the Philadelphia Eagles. I believe he also was a quarterback's coach. And then Steve Wilks, a positions coach that Greg Williams worked with last year. I believe it was defensive backs. And so Steve Wilks replaces Jeff Fisher as the DC here in St. Louis. As for some other position changes, Greg Schiano is promoted to Seattle's head coach. So Johnny Lynn ends up being the fired coach of Chicago, joins Carolina as their DC. So he was very good with the New York Giants defense. He would have been a top caliber defensive coordinator. And so putting him on the Carolina Panthers is a great change. I think it's going to be great for him because he's going to work with a lot of great talent. Then we have Mike Tomlin being replaced by Raheem Morris. I believe he's the linebackers coach for Baltimore. So Baltimore just promotes from within. Josh McDaniels is replaced by Bobby Petrino. I think he's a running backs coach for San Francisco. Let's just say we all know Bobby Petrino has a clock that's winding down and how many years I'll use him. So he's going to step in for OC for a little bit. We'll see how he does. Then Bruce Arians is replaced by Dirk Koetter, the quarterbacks coach for San Francisco. And San Francisco went to 2 straight Super Bowls. They won the first one, then lost last year to Pittsburgh. So San Francisco looks to be the dominant team in the NFC West, or in the NFC entirely. And so a lot of good coaches coming from there, from Petrino to Koetter. Jim Johnson, in real life, retired this year, so I allowed him to retire from the Eagles. And Dale Lindsey is stepping in as he was a former, not a former, but he was a coach. Well, he was a former offensive coordinator, but he was a positions coach specifically with, Houston. He's a defensive line coach for Houston. And so he's stepping in as the defensive coordinator for the Eagles. And then Dave Campo got fired because the Chiefs had an underwhelming season, largely due to their defense. So I fired Campo. And Al Groh from Dallas Cowboys, he used to be a head coach for other teams before. He gets the nod here as the DC for Kansas City. Now to retirements. This is going to be the last part of this video. So Bears, Urlacher, Eddie George, 2 big names being retired, maybe a little bit early. Mike Goff, Jason Elam. Don't worry about coaches. Steven Davis retires. Rondé Barber retires. Let's see, who else? Colts, Cooper Carlisle, Springs. Bledsoe's retired. Fred Taylor, big guy there, replaced by Steven Jackson. Dan Neal. Bobby Taylor, the Falcons, was a big deal. He was a defensive player of the year multiple times, top guy. Ty Law is out for the Panthers, but not Gannon. Gannon is still in the league. Ferrier, Berger, Orlando Pace was telling me he was retiring all year. Jeff Saturday for the Ravens. Alan Faneca from Pittsburgh. Barry Sims. And then Ahmad Plummer. So those are the retirements. We'll get to you very quickly with the off-season free agent signings.